April 14th, 1821. Exiled to the island of St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte had still a few days to live. That morning, he dictated a very strange letter.
Governor, the Emperor Napoleon died on the following a long and painful illness. I have the honor of bringing this to your attention.
All that remained was to fill in the gap. The emperor had just prepared the template for the announcement of his death to be delivered to the governor of the island. He was determined to organize all aspects of his own death. Death was no stranger to him. They had been competing for years. He had rubbed shoulders with it. More than that, he had challenged it.
He was convinced that his life would not end before his destiny was accomplished. He said it on several occasions. The cannonball which will finish me off has not yet been cast.
Cannon, fistfight, bomb, knife, poison, musket. On at least 6 occasions, death had come so close without actually touching him that he was firmly convinced he was exceptional. Could this be one of the keys to understanding the psychology of a man who remains a mystery? Defy death in order to create a character of legend.
His basic aim was to cross over the inevitability of death in order to live on afterwards. That's posterity.
The emperor was impatient. Impatient that death should crown a legend which he had started to build when Napoleon was still only Bonaparte. Legend would have it that Bonaparte was a predestined child. Born in Corsica to a prominent family, he was sent to France for military training. It is said that while at school he was already a natural leader, even marshalling snowball fights with authority. In reality, the future emperor did not stick out from the crowd.
Nothing indicated that he would have a destiny. He didn't even think it himself. In that respect, he was very different from a lot of would-be leaders, or in any case those who have left their mark on history, who often had a clear sense of predestination. Napoleon had nothing of that.
A captain in the army of the Revolution, he first drew attention to himself by taking the town of Toulon from royalists. He began dreaming of glory. However, there was nothing extraordinary about the battle. His career was at a standstill, to the point of him writing to his brother Joseph.
I have little attachment to life. Everything pushes me to challenge fate and destiny. And if this continues, my friend, I will end up not stepping aside as a carriage passes.
But in March 1796, Bonaparte's destiny was to change. He was 27. He was a general, and the Republic needed him. The European monarchies had formed a new coalition against revolutionary France. Strategic battles took place along the Rhine. The young Bonaparte was given a secondary mission: create a diversion by attacking Austria on Italian soil. However, against all expectations, Bonaparte broke through the Austrian army and headed straight for Milan with its small Italian army.
The Italian army wasn't intended to win massive campaigns. It was there to occupy part of the Austrian army while the French armies were passing by the north, through Germany. What Bonaparte did with his Italian offensive was to completely inverse the military geopolitics of the moment. He became the French general, and his army became the French army, which posed a genuine threat to Vienna when it was expected to be threatened from the north.
Bonaparte pushed on. A few months later, he approached Verona. But there was a strategic point that it was essential to reach, the village of Arcole. However, his troops were heavily outnumbered by those awaiting him there.
He started thinking it would be interesting to cross the marshland surrounding the position of Arcole, just north of the Adige River, because the marshes were so difficult to cross on foot that this would counteract the numerical superiority of the Austrians. So there he was in the middle of the marshes, knowing that at some point he would have to cross the Arcole bridge.
By the morning of the 15th of November, Bonaparte had successfully achieved the first part of his plan. His troops had arrived in the Italian marshes without facing resistance. But the hardest part still remained. He now needed to cross the bridge leading to the strategic village of Arcole. This bridge was strongly defended by enemy forces, and he was in danger of losing a lot of men. The result of the battle was at stake. He needed to make a decision.
At this point, Bonaparte took a gamble on trying to launch all his troops in an assault on enemy positions.
He was a very rational man, someone very calculating. But at the same time, this rational part was tempered by the irrationality of a gambler. He was also someone ready to bet everything on a hand, at the risk of losing it all.
Flag in hand, Bonaparte advanced onto the bridge, motivating his troops to follow him. It was a reckless, unreasonable act. His men followed him to protect him from certain death. Beside him was Muron, his aide-de-camp, who he referred to as his guardian angel and who had been with him since the victory at Toulon. Faced with enemy fire, Muron used his body as a shield. He took a bullet straight to the heart. Firing increased. There was a rout. Bonaparte fell into the marshes. He was dragged unconscious from the mud onto the opposite bank.
He slipped, fell into the mud, into the ditches, which were very deep. He might have drowned if not for the intervention of his brother Louis, who came and extricated him from the ditch. End of story.
Bonaparte had failed. The bridge remained impassable. It was to take 2 more days of fighting and the reinforcements of General Massena before the bridge was finally crossed and the Austrians dislodged from Arcole. Bonaparte could continue his march onwards. He won a fresh victory at Rivoli, then still others which brought him to within 100 kilometers of Vienna. The retreating Austrians signed the peace treaty of Campo Formio, which brought to an end a 5-year war. And yet, from this whole glorious Italian campaign, the most famous episode remains the failed crossing of the bridge of Arcole. Bonaparte had ended up in the mud. He had lost his friend Muron. But he had found the proof that he had been chosen by destiny.
The sacrifice of Muron, his death, was considered proof that he should not die. Others could die, but as for himself, he was to follow his destiny, and he was protected.
Before even returning home from Italy, Bonaparte had already rewritten the story of Arcole. He ordered a painting from the young artist Joseph-Antoine Gros.
What Arcole became afterwards was something very different from the actual battle. And in particular, this image, this painting by Gros, which shows Bonaparte leading the army of the Republic across the Arcole Bridge, flag in hand, face turned behind him, in the same way the goddess of history was represented at the time.
This was how the failed crossing of the Bridge of Arcole was depicted, vastly exaggerated. This standoff with death became the cornerstone of his legend.
I will no longer look at myself as a simple general, but as a man called to influence the fate of a people. I see myself in history. So was born the spark of great ambition.
Bonaparte no longer doubted he had a destiny, but power didn't interest him, not yet. He hungered for adventure. Basking in the glory of his Italian campaign, he set sail from Toulon with 50,000 soldiers. His mission was to conquer Egypt and sever the route to the Indies for the English enemy. Bonaparte crisscrossed Egypt. He gained victories. He also suffered bitter defeats. But in France, this mattered little. The echo of his adventures in the land of the pharaohs was only to increase his prestige. However, Bonaparte had not been gone a year before the situation once again became critical. At the borders, war had been rekindled in the face of a new coalition. At home, uprisings were growing in Brittany, Vendée, Midi, and Corsica, as well as in conquered territories such as in Italy. The situation was bordering on anarchy.
The French were going hungry. Safety was no longer assured. There were no roads anymore. Everything was in ruins. And above all, the country was in an absolutely disastrous state from both an economic and civic viewpoint.
The 5 members of the Directory leading the country since the end of the convention were completely out of their depth. There were constant rumors of a conspiracy. One of the directors, Emmanuel Sieyès, took the initiative. He wanted to organize a coup d'etat to establish a stronger power. But he needed a general to subdue resistance, a general who was popular and available. A few thousand kilometers away, Bonaparte kept himself informed of everything going on in Paris. He realized it was time to return. He abandoned his army in Egypt and left in the middle of the night aboard a frigate bearing the name of Muron, the friend who had sacrificed himself for him at the Bridge of Arcole. He had been gone a year. However, he was greeted by cheering crowds upon his arrival in Fréjus. Avignon, Valence, Lyon, the reaction was the same everywhere.
In everybody's minds, Bonaparte remained the symbol of victories from the time of the Italian campaign, the person who had managed to impose a peace treaty on Austria and restore peace in France. The image of the conquering general remained.
Bonaparte was not mistaken. He had become the most popular man in France, the awaited savior. He agreed to become part of Sieyès' plot. On the 9th of November 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, the coup d'etat was launched. Under the pretext of a royalist conspiracy, the Directory relocated the 2 parliamentary assemblies, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, to the Château de Saint-Cloud. It was said that this was to protect them. In fact, it was to isolate them. At the same moment, Bonaparte was named commander of the Army of the Interior. He was to control Paris and wait for Parliament to vote in the new constitution of the conspirators. But Bonaparte was not for waiting around. The next morning, Bonaparte shook up the proceedings. He himself went to Saint-Cloud, where the parliamentary members were assembled. He was hoping to take advantage of the coup d'etat to take power. But he knew that during the night, there had been plotting against him. If the coup d'etat failed, he would end up on the gallows. He was going to harangue the members to speed up their decision.
He was a soldier. He didn't like politicians. He didn't know how to talk to them. Above all, he had seen assemblies during the revolution and had learned to despise them. When he spoke, he was in the habit of being applauded and cheered. He was in the habit of people remaining silent because he was used to an audience of soldiers. So the decision which he then took could be said to be somewhat excessive and rash. He would go and persuade the assembly by the strength of his eloquence.
Bonaparte initially went before the first chamber, the ancients. He knew they looked on him quite favorably.
The audience was won over, but nonetheless they didn't applaud, because seeing a uniformed soldier take to the tribune was not in the parliamentary morals of the revolution.
Bonaparte was tense, clumsy, talking to them as if they were soldiers.
They say I want to establish a military government. I am bombarded with calumny. Remember that I march side by side with the god of victory and the god of fortune.
For these people, the parliamentary tribune represented legality and the legitimacy of Parliament. So seeing a general take to the tribune saying, "I am the god of victory," went against the grain.
Bonaparte was taken aback that someone would dare to interrupt him, insult him. His aide-de-camp advised him to cut his speech short. So he decided to go and convince the second chamber, the Council of 500, which was much more hostile towards him, but which was presided over by his brother Lucien.
When he arrived, the members were chiding each other and quarreling. There was screaming and shouting.
Bonaparte tried to take the tribune, but he was prevented from speaking. There were cries of "Outlaw Bonaparte, long live the Republic."
Fists were raised to the point of having to exfiltrate him. Grenadiers entered the room, which didn't help matters. They grabbed him and dragged him towards the exit.
He was terrified. He scratched his face to the point of drawing blood.
The members grabbed at him. It seemed he received a few punches as he passed, and they managed to get him out. It was at this point that he had an attack.
Why had his nerves given way? How could this valiant military leader have succumbed to a group of men in togas? For the first, and perhaps only time in his life, Bonaparte had been afraid.
Bonaparte was not afraid of death as such, but just certain kinds of death, being executed or lynched by a crowd. That particular perspective frightened him. Dying from a bullet wound or a cannonball on the field of battle didn't frighten him. On the other hand, falling beneath the punches of a crowd made him panic, robbed him of his self-control.
But, like at Arcole, Bonaparte was to turn defeat into victory.
Could my good fortune triumph over the most formidable armies just to fall before a handful of dissidents?
He transformed the jostling of the 19th of Brumaire into attempted assassination.
Bonaparte, covered in blood, his uniform in disorder. The troops could easily believe in an attempt on the life of their general. And that's what they were told. That's what Lucien Bonaparte would end up telling them by saying that the council was under the domination of people carrying daggers. The idea of daggers was very present in the coup d'etat of the 18th of Brumaire. They tried to kill your general, and as his brother, I know that he will fight for liberty. Help him. It was at this point that Bonaparte, who had taken a grip on himself, ordered the evacuation of the meeting hall of the Council of 500.
These imaginary daggers were a new episode in the legend. Bonaparte had triumphed over death. He'd done better than Caesar.
The invention of the dagger episode was obviously a reference to the assassination of Caesar and was the basis of propaganda for the new regime, which effectively took over. Bonaparte seemed like a Caesar who had escaped the daggers of the conspirators.
His momentary illness of the 19th of Brumaire was forgotten. The assassination attempt made him invincible. Sieyès and the other conspirators would have to stand aside. Bonaparte was named first consul at the head of the state. Having become Caesar, Bonaparte wanted to accomplish his destiny by building an empire. The new painting he ordered from the artist Gros depicted him as a legislator.
Napoleon once said that he was of the race of men who are founders, and that is essential for understanding his character.
Aside from his dreams of military glory, there were his dreams of civic glory. That's to say, he wanted to be the one who would, in his own words, close the abyss of the revolution, reconcile the French, rebuild a society, rebuild a state.
But by centralizing authority, the first consul became the target of all conspiracies. This didn't bother him too much until the Grim Reaper paid him a fresh visit. On Christmas Eve, the first consul would have preferred to stay at the Tuileries. Social niceties were not on top of his agenda. But how to resist the woman he loved most in the world? The Empress, his dear Josephine, insisted that he come to the opera. This time, death came right up close. Bonaparte had just survived the first planted bomb attack in history. A terrible booby-trapped cart attack. The Rue Saint-Nicaise was devastated. The bombing took place a few hundred meters from the Tuileries. A little earlier, a man had given a bread roll seller 12 sous to keep an eye on his cart. Hiding a little further off, he lit the fuse when the cortege left the Tuileries. Bonaparte was indeed the target, but his carriage passed in front of the street trader a few seconds before the explosion. More than 60 were wounded, and the young peddler was amongst the 20 dead. Bonaparte kept his calm. He went to the opera as if nothing had happened. Rumor of the bombing had preceded him, and he received an extended ovation for his cool-headedness.
This confirmed his faith in his own invincibility. That's to say, that he was blessed with good fortune and nothing could touch him.
But he also took this attack as a warning sign. His death could cut short his work.
If I die in 4 or 5 years, all will be set up. It will work. If I die before that, I don't know what will happen.
He realized how fragile his power was, and he realized that as long as there were no solid institutions, as long as his power hadn't been definitively established, he would always be the target of attacks.
At the time of the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, they were already at the end of the first year of government. A little more than that, in fact. And much had been done. Reform had been made to administration and justice. Austria had been beaten, and treaties were being negotiated with almost all of Europe. So throughout the country, at least for those in the know, there was a sort of sense of stabilization and the hope that exterior and interior peace would soon be achieved. The attack against Bonaparte came as something of an electroshock because people were saying, but what would have happened if they'd managed to kill Bonaparte?
Bonaparte took advantage of this favorable climate. He had himself named consul for life. This gave him the right to choose his successor. His power was absolute. On December 2nd, 1804, the first consul was crowned emperor. Taking the place of the Pope, he himself placed the crown on the head of his wife, Josephine. He became Napoleon I. When interior peace had been re-established, he set off on new conquests. He who had been so close to the abyss went from success to success, spectacularly so at Austerlitz. Against the new coalitions, the general did not lose a single battle. The empire was constantly growing. Europe was at his feet. In the summer of 1809, Napoleon took up residence at Schönbrunn Palace, near to Vienna, to negotiate peace. Clearly invincible, he had just beaten the Austrians for the 4th time at Wagram. Every morning at 10, he went to inspect the troops, until the day when death made a new attempt. A German with a knife was intercepted during the inspection of the troops, a certain Friedrich Stups. He had only been a few meters from the emperor. Why would someone want to kill him? Had his conquests not brought liberty to the people? Had he not imposed on the whole of Europe his civil code, the benefits of his administration, the French revolutionary ideals? Since the booby-trapped cart of Saint-Nicaise 7 years earlier, death had never come so close.
He wanted to understand why someone would wish to kill him, and why that someone would be German, because that was just as important. In Napoleon's way of thinking, which was extraordinarily French, the predominance of France was good for the continent. So he didn't concern himself too much with what the public thought of his projects. After all, he was going to destroy feudalism. He was going to reorganize the states. He was going to improve finances and create a system in which France was obviously the center, because France was always better than the rest.
Napoleon wanted to question the man. He wanted to speak face to face with this young terrorist. The would-be assassin was not at all what Napoleon had expected. Stups was just a sweet-faced, well-brought-up adolescent of 17. Napoleon insisted, "Why do you want to kill me?" "I wanted to kill you because you're an oppressor. What if I pardon you? You would be wrong to, because I would try to kill you again. The young hothead was having none of it. He would have to be executed. Napoleon recommended that his interior minister stifle the affair.
I wanted to inform you of this event in order that it not be given more consideration than it seems to merit. If questions should arise, this individual needs to be passed off as mad.
In reality, this new death warning deeply disturbed him, because it underlined a point about which he had become obsessed over recent years. Who would replace him if he was killed?
Heredity had obsessed Bonaparte since the beginning. And unfortunately, Josephine could no longer have children. So how could a dynasty be founded without an heir?
It's true that the imperial constitution provided for the situation where an emperor had no natural children. Except that Napoleon was of the opinion, and I think he was right, that only his own child would have legitimacy once established on the throne.
He decided there was no more time to lose. He would have to repudiate Josephine and, as he somewhat bluntly put it, marry a womb. But that was pretty much what it came down to.
The knife of Staps was to be fatal for Josephine. Napoleon divorced her on the 15th of December 1809 at the Tuileries, just 2 months after the assassination attempt. He then married Marie-Louise, daughter of Francis I of Austria. It was a political marriage celebrated by painters, but became a loving union from which was born a much-awaited son a year later. Whatever happened, the continuation of his work seemed assured by an heir. The name Napoleon was handed down to posterity. The emperor was at his pinnacle, when, for the first time, destiny turned its back on him. In June 1812, the great army of Napoleon launched an assault on the Russia of the Tsar. In 3 months, the emperor reached Moscow easily, too easily. After which came a string of misfortunes. The Tsar burning the city rather than conceding the battle. The retreat with freezing conditions as the principal enemy. The catastrophic crossing of the Berezina, when the ice gave way beneath the horses' hooves. The Russian campaign was a disaster. And yet, a year later, Napoleon reformed an army for a counterattack, but Europe knew that he was no longer invincible. It was the beginning of the end. Cracks appeared in the empire. Russia, joined by Prussia and Austria, inexorably pushed back. Spain was lost, then Germany, Holland, Italy. His empire was holding by a thread. Generals abandoned him one after another. On March 30th, 1814, coalition troops entered Paris. The night was coming to an end, but Napoleon was not sleeping. He was finishing a letter to the Empress Marie-Louise. One letter amongst dozens written each week, a letter not quite like the others.
Adieu, my sweet Louise. You are what I love most in the world. My misfortunes only touch me by the pain they bring you. Kiss your son. Adieu, my Louise. I am yours.
His decision was made. He wanted to die. He had decided to drink Condorcet, this lethal mixture which he always carried with him in case he was caught in an ambush. His generals had betrayed him. His empire had crumbled. He no longer had control, and it was the first time.
He felt that his destiny had run its course, and at the same time, he was of the old school. So he thought of all the characters from antiquity who had put an end to their days. I think this was basically the image he wanted to leave to posterity. It was a question which obsessed him, and which was very important to a man who, at the end of the day, couldn't accept being beaten. The way to not accept being beaten was to leave the world.
But apparently, death did not want him.
How difficult it is to die. How unfortunate to have a constitution which repels the end of a life which I hungered to have done with.
There is a hypothesis on why Napoleon didn't die from taking this poison, which is that it was old, that it was stale, and no longer particularly lethal.
We know that he vomited some sort of grayish matter. We know that there was a glass with a diluted product in it. Did he swallow it all, or just a little bit?
Was it really a suicide attempt? Did Napoleon really want to die? That's something we can never ask him.
The next day, as though everything were normal, the emperor ratified the Treaty of Fontainebleau. This attempted suicide was only to be evoked by those close to him long after his death. Napoleon bid adieu to the army and took exile on the island of Elba, while Louis XVIII restored the monarchy. This was just a parenthesis. Hardly had he arrived when energy and ambition returned to him. In the micro-monarchy which had been ceded to him, the fallen emperor was hemmed in. He spent many hours walking without speaking of his intentions. But he attentively followed the news from France.
Dear Count Bertrand, tell my brother that I have received his letter, that he should not be surprised at not receiving a reply. I write to no one.
Louis XVIII's return to power was not going well. Napoleon was on the lookout.
He knew that the attempt to graft the monarchy back onto France was not taking, so he regarded this as an opportunity.
What's more, he knew he was under threat. He knew that he would not be allowed to remain so close to the continent, so close to Europe indefinitely. So he prepared a comeback. He talked of it to no one around him. He took this mad and solitary decision to return.
On February 26, 1815, 10 months after his arrival, Napoleon escaped in the middle of the night. He left the island of Elba with 1,000 faithful soldiers.
On the face of it, this expedition was totally insane, because it meant crossing the Mediterranean. 3 days at sea in the middle of the English fleet, the French royalist fleet, landing with 1,000 men when the royal army numbered 150,000. He was extraordinarily fortunate during these 3 days at sea. On several occasions, he encountered battleships which could have sent him to the seabed. That didn't happen.
While he was expected to set ashore in Italy, he surprised everyone by landing in France at Golfe-Juan. Having crossed the mountains, he immediately began his return to Paris to great acclaim. Groups of peasants formed up with his soldiers as he advanced. No shots fired, no resistance.
Obviously, during the journey, he thought that his luck had returned. He thought that in the end, what had happened before was just an accident, and now he could continue.
On the evening of the 6th of March, 1815, he arrived at the village of Coeur. If destiny smiled on him, the next day he would enter Grenoble. As usual, he only slept a few hours. He knew that the day would be decisive. Since his escape from the island of Elba, destiny had been with him. But it wasn't over. Advanced troops sent back word. The troops of Louis XVIII were waiting for him a few kilometers ahead. Their mission was to impede Napoleon's return to Paris. It was on the banks of Lake Lafray that Napoleon was once more to put his life in the hands of destiny. This is where the royal army was awaiting the fallen emperor's supporters. The encounter seemed inevitable, and they were outnumbered 5-1.
Above all, this man was a gambler, meaning that while he still had a card in his hand, he would play it. He knew that with each bet, he was on the edge of the precipice. Everything could collapse. But because he had this extraordinary confidence in himself, he did it anyway.
The armies were now face to face. Napoleon had the blue, white and red flag unfurled and played the Marseillaise. Then he advanced all alone towards the enemy troops. This time, he was to challenge death looking it straight in the eye. He called out to the soldiers, "Do you not recognize your emperor, who so often led you into victory? Then shoot, if you do not recognize me."
He probably felt they wouldn't dare shoot at him. He impressed them so much, he'd been so much part of their lives for 15 years, that they wouldn't fire on him. But at the same time, he was running a considerable risk because he was at the mercy of every soldier. It only needed a single shot, and he was dead.
A captain gave the order to fire. But the guns remained silent. And the situation changed. Soldiers broke from the ranks shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" The two armies congratulated each other. Napoleon had won his bet.
My good Louise, I write to you from Grenoble that I will soon be in Paris. Crowds of people run before me. Whole regiments are leaving everything to join me.
The return was triumphal. Louis XVIII took flight. Napoleon arrived in the capital on the 20th of March without a drop of his troops' blood being spilt.
It was magnificent, up until the moment when Napoleon reached Paris. Once there, he realized that the situation was not as simple as he had thought. Firstly, there was the exterior threat, when the Congress of Vienna, uniting all the European powers, learned of Napoleon's return. The first thing they did was to outlaw him. That is to say, put him outside European law. It was decided that the armies which had defeated the Napoleonic armies a year earlier would march on France.
The Allies didn't declare war on France. This was a first in history. They declared war on one man. In the Treaty of March 25th, the Allied parties declared war on Napoleon Bonaparte, and not on France. They declared war on Napoleon Bonaparte in order to neutralize him, because he was a threat to world peace.
The second thing he realized was that in the euphoria surrounding his return, he had lost sight of the fact that, politically speaking, he had no allies when he arrived in Paris. He realized that both the interior and exterior situations were bad. And as he had often done in the past, he tried to take things in hand through a military operation.
The emperor went off to fight again with a new army. He headed for Belgium, where the vast majority of coalition troops awaited him. He gained a final victory at Ligny. On the plains of Waterloo, he was a hair's breadth from winning. But fortune abandoned him. He was definitively beaten. Napoleon abdicated a second time and went to the port of Rochefort. He considered taking flight to the United States, but he was blocked by the English Navy. His back to the wall, he finally surrendered. He was sent off to rot 7,000 kilometers away in the middle of the Atlantic on the island of St. Helena.
I should have died at Waterloo, perhaps before. Misfortune is when a man seeking death cannot find it. People were killed all around me, but I could not find the cannonball.
France was now far off, several thousand kilometers away. During the first months, he considered escaping once again, as he had done at Elba. Time had run out. At 48 years of age, he was being eaten away by an ever-worsening interior illness, an ulcer or cancer. He was already thinking of the hereafter.
From the moment when Napoleon knew he would never leave St. Helena, he began much more consciously working on his legend. He told his entourage this. He used immodest phrases like, "If Christ hadn't died on the cross, he wouldn't be God," implying that he had to suffer like a martyr. He was already convinced that posterity would recognize his merit.
On St. Helena, the despot wanted to transform into a victim. But for this scenario to work, a persecutor was needed. This was to be the English governor, Hudson Lowe.
Lowe would have probably been completely capable of getting on with Napoleon. But Napoleon didn't want a jailer who was understanding or clement. Napoleon wanted a jailer who was ruthless, who harassed him, who restricted his liberties, because he wanted posterity to see him as a martyr. You could almost say that Napoleon created Hudson Lowe. Napoleon was far more intelligent than Hudson Lowe, who he basically manipulated.
Napoleon provoked the governor. When asked to appear, he would hide. The more he was bullied, the happier he was, aware that his image was gradually changing.
The martyr strips me of my tyrant's skin.
He was the artist of his destiny. He sensed that by becoming a victim, he would be seen differently. He was to completely inverse his image. Instead of being an intransigent despot, he suddenly became the underdog. He created this wonderful sort of Christ-like image. Of a modern-day Christ.
Le Christ de l'époque moderne.
As of March 1821, his health deteriorated. It was no longer posterity which needed to be prepared, but death itself. It needed to be equal to the event.
Napoleon suffered a very long death, very slow and undoubtedly very painful. His death dragged on, and that allowed him to stage it. He did this very consciously, despite his suffering. He managed to stage the death of a sovereign.
I die in the apostolic and Roman religion, into which I was born more than 50 years ago.
Napoleon, who didn't seem to believe in anything other than destiny, suddenly seems to have been touched by faith. A few days before his death, he even asked to take confession.
He indeed took confession, but I don't think that this meant he was returning to the Catholic faith. Not at all. I think he did it because as a sovereign who had been crowned at Notre Dame by the Pope, he needed to die a Christian in order to fully accomplish his sovereign's destiny. He also wanted a reminder that his destiny was now sacred.
On the 5th of May at 5:49 in the afternoon, death, which he had so often defied, finally triumphed over Napoleon. Unless it was the opposite. Because the story of Napoleon doesn't end with his death. As he had hoped, it took on new dimensions. The 19th century portrayed him as a new messiah. The man who believed in his destiny became a legend. 20 years after his death, his body was repatriated from St. Helena to Paris. An imposing tomb was erected at Les Invalides. One of his most ferocious adversaries, the writer Chateaubriand, presumed his destiny in this way. In life, he could not win the world. In death, it is his.